so that and welcome to those on Zoom and over to Rabbi Bennett. Good morning, and thank you to Rabbi Jacobson once again for asking me to come and share some words of Torah. Always nice to be here and seeing the assembled crowds. And what better way to set aside some time every morning to come and daven in not only as a place of a lovely minyan with focus and seriousness and approach to tefillah, but also a sense of camaraderie and community, which is very hugely important. Kol hakavod for all involved in organising it and being part of it. Interesting that in a short time, objects that would have been absolutely the norm in people's homes become obsolete. I was thinking about a couple of those objects, which I definitely saw in my grandparents' home and in my parents' home when I was children would have absolutely no idea. And they are an address book, a phone table with a phone that has a dial that you move around with your digits, and a pen. Because we can all remember that that's what used to take place. You would have a space in the house that was screwed into the wall where if you wanted to make a phone call, you'd go and stand there. And if someone would phone, you'd repeat your phone number back to the person that had dialed your number. I can still remember this voice, Alav Shalom, saying her phone number back to me. I can still remember the phone number as I phoned. And then if there was a message, you'd sit there and write it down. And my children, if we walked into someone's house and they had that, they would have absolutely no idea what it is. Because now we all are blessed and cursed, perhaps in equal measures, to have smartphones everywhere we go. And there's no need for such a thing. And with that advance in technology, it has become the ubiquitous use of the WhatsApp group. Now, I'm sure if we did a quick survey, which we don't have time for, but around the table, we could all probably tot up the number of WhatsApp groups we're all part of. For schools, for neighborhoods, for grandchildren, for colleagues, for volunteer organizations, for chesed, all over the place. There is a very, very interesting WhatsApp group that takes place in the UK between Rabbanim, which is where they share their interesting shilas. And you can imagine what a WhatsApp group is like anyway. So a WhatsApp group of rabbis discussing the shilas they've been asked, it can make some quite interesting reading. And I would suggest putting it on mute is sometimes a good idea, because it does tend to go off quite a lot of interesting questions. Now, I'm in the position where I do occasionally get asked questions from students in school and members of the community. And I noted down a few questions I've been asked in the past couple of months. I thought were rather interesting ones. Now, I'll explain why I'm asking these in a second. First question just happened last week. We have students in school that, for whatever reason, are eligible for free lunches, what's called free school meals, but definitely been in the headlines over the past few years. And we realized, to our dismay, that on Rosh Chodesh Av, the company delivering food had not adjusted the order, and the sandwiches that were delivered for some of the students were fleshik, were meaty sandwiches. Now, and there are many students, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi, from Rosh Chodesh Av that are not consuming meat. So we had a question: what do we do? Do we serve them the food? Do we try and arrange some other food in that situation? I'll leave the answer hanging, but that was the question. That was the question that was discussed on that particular day. Another day, this was a fun morning. Due to an unscrupulous piece of toast somewhere in the building, 500 young ladies in the middle of Shemona Esrei of a morning were escorted from the hall where they were davening out into the tennis courts due to a fire alarm. They're all in the middle of davening. To which point, all of the girls wanted to know was, well, what do we do? We're literally in the middle of Shemona Esrei. Do we start again? Do we just go back to the beginning? Do we carry on from where we're going to? We even had some girls that managed not to talk the whole way, that came up and did their best sign language charades impression to understand, to ask what we should be doing in that situation. That was certainly an interesting question. And Rabbi Birnbaum and I had a bit of a conference in the middle of the tennis court to decide what we should tell everyone to do in that situation. Another question came up in a halacha lesson this year, just before Pesach. A student who was learning the halachas of preparing in terms of cleaning for Pesach and food preparation for Pesach, which products one should avoid buying that are not supervised, and came up to ask me at the end of the lesson and said, well, I always go to my grandparents for the Seder, and I know they're not so particular about some of the halachas you've taught. What should I do? I obviously don't want to embarrass them. It's our family, we go there. But nevertheless, I don't want to eat something that potentially could be a problem, could contain chametz on Pesach. How do I deal with that situation? All interesting questions, sometimes asked. And I think it's an interesting question. It's to try and understand an approach to any of these questions, whether the questions of a Torah mitzvah or a Rabbanan mitzvah, where exactly does the halacha come from? That's in fact what I want to discuss this morning with a fascinating Gemara, a famous Gemara, but given approach to Yesodot. When we generate halacha, when you're asking your questions to Rabbi Lister, or you're looking up something that's been written, or you're texting Shaila text to find an answer to something, where exactly does that halacha come from? What is the approach to understanding halacha? Now, we know famously in Parshas Bahar, Rashi tells us that Parshas Bahar, the mitzvah Shemitah, which is at the beginning of that parsha, mentions that the mitzvah of Shemitah was given by Har Sinai. And Rashi says, why are we mentioning again, seemingly out of place at the beginning of that parsha, that the mitzvah of Shemitah, of leaving the land fallow in the 7th year, was given at Har Sinai to tell us, Ma etzel Shemitah, Eitzel Har Sinai, what does this mitzvah have to do with Har Sinai? That to say the mitzvah of Shemitah, along with all the other mitzvahs and their details, were given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Mount Sinai. It wasn't something that was added on later. It was given as part of the initial divine revelation of the giving of the Torah, and that was given by Hashem to Moshe at Har Sinai. That's the one approach. Halacha is divine. It's given as part of the Torah. We know we have a Torah Shebechsav, a written Torah which is contained in the Chumash, and the Torah Shebal Peh, the explanation of the details of how to apply those mitzvahs, that came eventually written down in the Mishnah and the Gemara and became the basis for the works of Halacha. But they all take their root in the original instructions that Hashem gave to Moshe and Aaron. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we know, for those of us that make it to shul for the beginning of davening, which I'm not always there for myself, is that we say the Yud Gimel Midas each morning. At that point of davening, the Yud Gimel Midas Torah and the Dreshes for him, the 13 principles that Rabbi Yishmael recorded and codified, which are the 13 ways which the rabbis are able to interpret and expand on halacha, which seems to be an entirely different principle and methodology. We've got on the one hand the Sinai direct link back to Hashem and what he told Moshe, and on the other hand we have this other principle, which is the rabbis can not make it up, but using the principles that have been given down from generation to generation, dating back to Sinai, they can explain Torah with their own methodologies of understanding and their own investigation. Two seemingly different principles within the explanation of and the generation of halacha. Now, very, very briefly, I want to read the words inside of this Gemara because it is a hugely interesting and famous Gemara. There is a dispute in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, I'm on Nun Tes Amud Aleph, of a discussion between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim of the status of a particular oven. Okay, a particular oven. It's known in the Gemara as the Tanur Shalach Noi. Famous oven that was constructed in a very peculiar way, which had layers of earth and layers of sand in between it and dirt between it, and it was an unusually constructed oven. And the question involving this oven was, did it have the status of a kli, of a vessel, that if it came into contact that something was tameh, that was ritually impure, would it impurify the oven? That was the question. And there was a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer, who said it was tahor, seeing as it was made from earthenware, which could not be able to be made impure. The Chachamim said it could become tameh. That's not the interesting part of this particular story, although that is an interesting dispute to understand what's going on over there. What happens next now in the Gemara is quite extraordinary. There is a dispute among the sages to try and prove backwards and forwards what was the correct halacha in terms of the status of this oven. And everything gets rather peculiar rather quickly. And Rabbi Eliezer says, he answers, he tried to bring all of the proofs in the world to prove his halacha was correct, and the Chachamim, the rabbis, did not accept it. So listen to what he does next. Amalehem, he says to them, the carob trees that were growing outside the base of Medrash, those trees should prove I'm right. How so? They would miraculously uproot themselves from the ground and they would start to move around 100 or 400 amts. And they did so. Miraculously, outside the walls of the base of Medrash, the trees are dancing around. Amrulo, the rabbis say back to Rabbi Eliezer, you want to bring me a proof from a carob tree? We're not interested in this. It's very nice. This doesn't help us in terms of understanding the halach. He goes back, but Amalehem, im halacha kamaisi, if the halacha is like me, then the stream of water that is running outside the base of Medrash, that should prove like me. And the water changes direction. From flowing one direction, it starts to flow back the other way. Amrulo, he says back to them, You want to bring me a proof from a flow of a river? We're not interested. The very walls of the Beis HaMedrash should prove that the halacha is like me, if I'm correct, says Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, and the walls of the Beis HaMedrash start to kind of fall in on them. Rabbi Yeshua, who was one of the rabbis assembled there and part of the Chachamim, he growls at the walls, Amalehem, im Talmidei Chachamim matznachim zeh et zeh. You've got the rabbis that I hear that are battling one another in order to know the halacha. Atem mativachim, what's it got to do with you? Walls of the Beis HaMedrash, don't get involved. Lo nafnim ipnei kvodo Rabbi Yeshua, therefore they do not fall down out of respect for Rabbi Yeshua, who's telling them not to get involved. Lo zakfu ipnei kvodo Rabbi Elazar, but they also don't stand straight again because of the honor given to Rabbi Elazar, who asked them to fall down. And they go back and continue this argument. So Rabbi Eliezer has one last proof, the most famous part of this Gemara, very familiar with us. This was his top trump. If I'm right, then there should be a heavenly proof. A proof that's totally supernatural, even more than anything up until this point. A heavenly voice emanates and says, and emanates and says that he's right, the halacha follows him. Listen to what the Chachamim say back. And he says the halacha is like him. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yeshua stands up on his legs for Amar, Loi Bashamayim he. The Torah is not given in heaven. Loi Bashamayim, the Torah is not from heaven. Meaning that don't get involved. Very nice, you've got a heavenly voice confirming that halacha is indeed like Rabbi Eliezer, but we're not interested. Gemara asks, what does that mean? Rabbi Yirmiyah, the Torah is already given at Mount Sinai. We're not interested in what a heavenly voice says. The Torah already says, how do we rule in halacha? After the majority. We've got a methodology of how do we understand how Torah is given, and we're not interested in heavenly voices. Now, this Gemara is incredibly perplexing of what's going on, incredibly interesting. And how can it be? We've got a heavenly voice saying that the absolute objective halacha should be following Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua and the other sages there at that point. Lo b'shamayim, we're not interested in what they're saying in heaven. We are deciding the halacha ourselves, seemingly incorrectly. If you've got a heavenly voice that says, this is the halacha, and we say, we're not interested in that, we're going to paskin ourselves, how can that be? Now, it's worth pointing out, there is a Masechta in Shas, that deals with this idea of when the Beis Din goes out of its way and actually brings a pshat halacha, which is incorrect, objectively incorrect. And there's a korban they have to bring, there's a whole process they have to go through. But here we're saying, we're not interested in what the heavenly voice is saying. We can rule in this idea. I think the way to understand this, and everything I'm saying is based on an essay from Rabbi Bernstein. He's basing it on the Beis Halevi in his commentary on the Torah and Parshas Yisro. This gives us a way of understanding another very enigmatic piece of Gemara, which is found in the Masechah Shabbos, which is discussing the conversation that took place between Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Malachim when Moshe goes up to receive the Torah on Har Sinai on the original Shavuos. And he arrives in Shemayim, Moshe, ready to receive the Torah. And whilst he's there, he is confronted by a group of heavenly angels. And the Gemara says, B'shasha ala Moshe namarim, Amru Malachi Hashar Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Malachim say to Hashem, Rabbeinu Shalom, and Lilot Isha Beinenu, what is this person born of a mother doing between us? Amalehem, Hashem says back to him, Torah Bar, he's come to the Kabbalah Torah Bar, he's come to receive the Torah. And the Malachim at this point argue back, this precious thing of the Torah, you're going to give it to people that are fallible, people that are perhaps going to not keep the name of the Torah. Surely the Torah should stay with us in Shemayim. At this point, Hashem says to Moshe, "No, defend yourself." Doesn't answer for him. Just defend yourself. Why should you get the Torah? They've got a point. You're going to take the Torah down to the world and give it to people, and the people will not necessarily be faithful to the Torah. Why should we give it to you? What does Moshe do? He starts to read through the Aseret HaDibros. He starts to read through the 10 Commandments and shows how each of those commandments are incompatible with the being of a spiritual being of a man. You were never in Mitzrayim, so how can you say that Hashem took you out of there? You don't have parents, so how could you do kibbud avim? In fact, when you've been here in the world, you've done things that are incorrect. You don't work, so how can you keep Shabbos? There's no jealousy in Shemayim, so how could you not be jealous? And he shows them, each of them, they're unable to do so. Okay, there's plenty more to say on this Gemara, but for the purposes of this, let's try and understand what exactly was the discussion going on between the Malachim and Moshe. The Beis HaLevi wants to suggest that, as we've said, there are two approaches to the giving of halacha. Trying to understand what was originally said at Har Sinai, or the process of the interpretation, the authority that was given to the rabbis. What was the Malachim's problem? How possibly could you rely on the interpretation of people to understand the Torah? We're not going to be able to get back to that point of Shemaim of what originally was given at that point. And therefore they say, Ma enish tizkarena. How could you mention people when it comes to the giving of the Torah? And therefore they say, don't give the Torah to Moshe, leave it up here, leave the authority solely in Shemayim. To which Moshe says, no, it's something which is relevant to people, and therefore people need to be given the authority to understand what is going on within the Torah. And that's their idea of this. In fact, the Rambam says in his introduction to his Perush Mishnah something fascinating. He says that the same way that Pinchas and Yehoshua that learns the Torah from Moshe in its original state was given, was the same format, the same way that Ravina and Rav Ashi, when they were debating the sugyas of the Gemara, learned the Torah. They didn't just sit there and listen to Moshe, but they debated, they understood, they tried to interpret in their own way, using the rules and principles by which the Torah is given by. And that's how they understood the Torah, and that's always been the way. So let's try and understand this. Why is it that we rely on the interpretation of the rabbis and ignore the Baskol, this heavenly voice, which surely is actually telling us what the correct halacha should be? So there's two suggestions why it should be. Why do we rely on majority ruling rather than actually understanding what this heavenly voice suggests as the halacha? So we can suggest two approaches. Approach number one is, assuming you've got genuine sages, wise, knowledgeable people in the room, if you come down to the majority, in likelihood, they're right. You've got more people saying Ameh rather than Tahor, and the people in the room are knowledgeable, then the presumption is that they must be right because there's more of them. That's approach number one, why we rely on Achmei Rab Nahatis, the majority. The other approach is perhaps what we're saying. It's not that we assume that the majority, the Roiv, is more right than the Miat, than the minority, but it's the halacha tells us to follow the majority. The halacha is given in a way which is down to the people to explain it. According to this second approach, we understand what Lo B'Shamayim he means. That the halacha, it's very nice that there could be this objective tradition of what was said at Har Sinai based on the heavenly voice, but halacha is not given in that way. It's down to the people to interpret, and the halacha follows that. And we see in many instances, the most famous example perhaps being Rosh Chodesh, that the Gemara says that the based in Shamala, the heavenly courts would only be Makadesh and Levana, would sanctify the new moon once the Adam had come in the based in Shamata. Once the Sanhedrin had declared the new moon in heaven, then that would be when they declared the new moon. It was based on what was happening down in this idea. Interesting, the Chasam Sofer explains, according to this first principle, that perhaps it's just about having the greater number that we assume they're right. And that's why we follow the idea of the majority. Then why is it we should ignore the Baskol? If the Baskol's right, if we're just saying, well, I assume if there's 32 saying this and say 28 saying something else, then we'll go with the majority. Well, but if you've got a proof of a Baskol that comes out and says this is the halacha, then why are we ignoring the minority? He says because it would be totally impractical for a system of halacha. It would be totally impractical because in any halachic debate, what would happen? Exactly the opposite of what Torah is as a religion. Is you could have one person that came and said, I had a dream last night. I just heard this heavenly voice, and therefore the halacha is following like me. Totally, you've taken it outside now the realm of debate and discussion. It becomes miraculous, which halacha has never been. It's down to that give and take between the sages. With Moshe Feinstein, in his introduction to his famous Igros Moshe, his collection of chuvas, questions how could it be that someone in the later generations could write a work of halacha? I'm thinking about all of the greats that come before him. The Kiva Eger, the Chasam Sofer, going back further, looking at the period of the Rishonim. You're looking at the works of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah in those generations, then to the Rishonim, the Rashi and the Rambam and the Ran and the Rosh. And how could it be that someone in the 1980s was writing works of halacha for the Jews in America of Moshe Feinstein? How could they do that? And he answers because that's how the Torah is given. It's given to that generation for someone should be able to paskin. And he says very beautifully, that is the understanding of the Gemara in Menachos. When Moshe is shown a vision of the future, he's shown the base of Medrash of Rabbi Akiva, and he's watching Rabbi Akiva teach Torah, and he's teaching and explaining every word and every letter of the Torah, including the crowns on top of the Torah. And Moshe looks at this and says to Hashem, I don't understand what he's saying. I don't know how to explain the crowns and their significance on the letters. And this is exactly the idea. Rabbi Akiva, through his debate and through his discussion, was able to bring out facets of the Torah that wasn't revealed to Moshe in the same way. Moshe says very beautifully. That's why it's called in the Gemara the tagin, the marks on top of the letters are called crowns, because those crowns represent the authority of the Kesser, the authority that's given to those next generations to be able to understand the halacha. We'll finish this with one final thought, which the Beis Halevi uses this principle to answer a famous question of the Magen Avraham about the Yontif of Shavuos. We know the addition to the Amida on the Yontif of Shavuos is we describe it as Man Matan Torasenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. First of all, one question we ask is, why is this Man Matan Torasenu, time of giving of our Torah, not just Man Matan Torah? Second question he asks is, how can we say that? What date do we celebrate Shavuos? Vav Sivan. What date originally was the Torah given? The 7th. Famously, the Gemara in Shabbat says that Moshe, in discussion with Hashem, decided to add an extra day of preparation before the Jewish people were ready to receive the Torah. And that was based on his understanding of Hashem's instruction. You would need a full day and a full night, or a night like a full day. And therefore, it ended up that the Torah was given on the 7th, even though it originally intended for it to be given on the 6th. But Moshe decided to give an extra day. Says the Beis Halevi, this is exactly the principle that we're seeing. Hashem doesn't arrive on Vav Sivan and say, 1 second, where is everyone? You're not ready. He waits until the next day to give the Torah, because that's the exact epitome of what the Torah is going to be. Hashem's given it, but it's down to the people to interpret it and to form it in their own ways within the principles that Hashem has given down. And Moshe here is explain those ideas within that idea, and therefore says the Beis Halevi to answer the Magen Avram's question: why is it Zman Matan Torah Seinu, the time of the giving of our Torah? Because we're celebrating on Shavuos that Hashem gave the Torah in Hashemayim, but it's now our Torah. It's down to us to do something with it, to interpret it, to understand it, and to apply it to make the world a better place. And the second idea of how can we say that on the 7th of Sivan, even though Hashem originally, on the 6th of Sivan, sorry, even though Hashem originally the Torah was given on the 7th, because Hashem agreed with Moshe that on that time the Torah was given. It was delayed a day, but throughout the subsequent years it was given. We celebrate that on the original day that Hashem intended, which is Vav Sivan. I think the idea we can take from all of this is, first of all, an appreciation of when we ask a question, the great skill and care and sensitivity that our rabbis are putting in to be able to answer our questions accurately, and also understanding that halacha is a process which is telling us a message of how we're going to embed it into our lives, into our families, into our communities, to try and make the world a better place.
Very much for that interesting talk. Does anyone have any comments, any questions you want to make?
Well, all three questions. On Rosh Chodesh Av. So I discussed these. I did discuss these not on a WhatsApp group, but with my colleagues in school. So with the Menaha Rabbi Golka and with Rabbi Birnbaum and with Joshua. So the girls were. We were told we decided we should leave the Sabbath for the girls. In particular, it was what's considered shasat chak in halacha. These are girls that, for whatever financial, personal reasons, weren't able to bring their own food to school, so it wouldn't be a problem for them to eat it. It was, perhaps only a problem with Rabbanon, and we know there are many people that during the 9 days are allowed to eat meat for particular reasons, so they were. Second question: the fire went on in the middle of Shemona Esrei, so the halacha was that they should go back and if they've not spoken, which was only one girl that I noticed. If they've not spoken, she could actually continue to the middle of the bracha she was up to, go to the beginning of that bracha and finish Shemona Esrei. I was hugely impressed with that she'd managed not to stay quiet. She'd managed to stay quiet and not have a conversation. Everyone else was told to go back to the beginning of the Amida and daven again. At that point, you can imagine how popular the staff member was that had made that piece of toast. And the eating the grandparents one is perhaps a slightly more complicated one. Needs some more eating at the grandparents' house on Pesach. It needed a bit more investigation. But my approach was going
Thank you very much. Okay, I will turn off the recording. We'll see you all next week on Zoom, and have an easy fast. And I'll just close the Zoom now.